Now we're talking about the second attempt at a national government. This time, it actually worked. In the summer of 1787, 55 men, also known as the framers of the U.S. Constitution, met to fix the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation. What's interesting is four-fifths of the framers participated in the Second Continental Congress, which passed the Articles of Confederation. So basically, it's the same group of people coming together, knowing they had deficiencies and wanting to somehow fix it. But again, remember, the framers sought a balanced view to create a system with concurrent powers. That means shared powers between states and the federal government. They did so by creating a national government that distributed powers between the central government and its subunits, such as states. And so, what we have here is that we have the southern states and we have the northern states, very different economic viewpoints. And they obviously knew that they needed to create a system, but it was about how to create a system that would work. So, in doing so, they needed to find somebody that can galvanize everybody, somebody that everybody respected. And so they decided to get General George Washington to preside over the Constitutional Convention. He was well respected because not only was he a general in the American Revolution, but he paid for revolutionary soldiers from his own pocket. And one-fifth of the attendees served under his command. That's quite a bit of people if you consider 55. So he was unanimously selected. And in order to fix the Articles of Confederation into something that is actually more effective as a governance system, the framers said, we have to have secret meetings because they wanted to prevent information from being discussed of information on their discussions from being relayed to the 12 states in order to prevent states from withdrawing from participation. Now you have to remember the initial purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation, and the states instructed their representatives, the 55 framers, to do so. But when the framers got together, they realized the Articles of Confederation was a failure. And so they went back to the drawing board. And in order to do that without being called back to your state, they had to have these secret meetings. And so part of their secret meetings, their meetings were all secret. Nobody shared anything about what happened. Roger Sherman, do you remember Roger Sherman? I hope so, because he was one of the five who drafted the Declaration of Independence. He created what is considered the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, which was a blend of the Virginia Plan and blend of the New Jersey Plan. Now, you'll never really need to know what the Virginia Plan was or the New Jersey Plan, but you're going to need to know the outcome of the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, as it's most notably known for as being. This includes a bicameral legislature, an upper house, which we call the Senate, and which has equal representatives from each state, regardless of population. So we have 50 states, and we have 100 senators. So a small state like Hawaii versus a large state like California, each send 2 senators. And so we have 100 senators representing 50 states. And the lower house was determined by proportional representation. Proportional representation is if you have 100 people and you have proportional representation. And so you only have five people who are going to be representatives. And you have 100 people over here in your country. One state has 60 people. Two states have 20 people each. So that means one state has 3 people, and each state that has 20 people will have one person representing. That's proportional representation. And in addition, these secret meetings that were to revise the Articles of Confederation, they knew that they needed an executive and a judiciary branch. So they created those two branches based on the deficiencies they found in the Articles of Confederation. Now, the point of contention was the determination of number of House of Representatives based on population. Again, the lower house was determined by proportional representation, but the question really was, how do we determine population? Now, you got to remember, back then, the only people who had voting rights were white men with property, but that wasn't the whole population, right? So delegates from free states did not want slaves to be counted. However, delegates from slave states wanted slaves to be counted, obviously, because if you're a southern state with slaves and you got a big workforce, you get to count them and you get more representatives at the lower house, also known as the House of Representatives. And so, because this was a point of contention, a major point of contention at the Constitutional Convention, they came up with a 3/5 compromise. And the 3/5 compromise is one of the most notable, not a positive note, but a notable moment in the Constitutional Convention that really made sure that the Constitution, this and the Bill of Rights being agreed upon, were the two most important elements that caused for this to work. And so they all agreed that 3/5 of a compromise was going to prevail, where each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person to determine the allocation of House of Representatives to states. And so with that compromise, we have the U.S. Constitution passed. Now, the process to pass the Constitution was agreed upon, excuse me. But the process to pass the Constitution, I laid out in this outline, is that the Constitutional Convention drafted documents in September 1787, a lot of sevens. Constitutional Congress passed the document in September 28th, 1787, and forwarded the Constitution to the states. In order for the Constitution to be ratified, 3/5 of the states needed to agree upon it, which means 9 of the 13 states. New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify in June 21st of 1788. So the ratification was secure. The Constitution was officially passed and became the law of the land on June 21st, 1788. So now factions. Factions. There's a ton of factions in every government organization, every government structure, and this was no different. So what you need to know, you absolutely need to know this for American history. The Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Can anybody out there tell me what that is? Don't worry, I will. Federalists favored strong central government with a bicameral national legislature. And that was promoted and pushed and urged to be law by the northern and free states. Now, the Anti-Federalists favored weak central government with a unicameral legislature. Because when you're a slave owning state and you know slavery's wrong and you know eventually slavery will end, you want to have slavery as long as possible from their viewpoint. And so having a weak central government was going to allow slavery to persist longer. But a strong national government was going to make it weak. Now, the sentiment back then, as you remember talking about Thomas Jefferson having written about King George III, his perpetuation with slavery around the world, they knew it was bad. Even Jefferson knew it was bad, even though he had a slave, or he had multiple slaves. In fact, he had children with his slaves. So eventually, they saw the writing was on the wall, and so they urged for a weak central government. Now, they lost, as you can tell, but that didn't mean that they eventually lost everything, right? So I'll get into that in just a moment. The new government began in January 1789. So each state, based on the new constitution, each state chose electors to vote for the president, and it wasn't by popular vote. So that's the Electoral College. President George Washington got the most votes, and so he became president. And John Adams, co-author of the Declaration of Independence, was named as vice president. In fact, John Adams was the second president. He was elected, and each state gets to choose to elect their House of Representatives. And at that time, each state legislature got to select their U.S. senators. Now, I told you I'd come back to this, and I am. So even though the southern states, they lost the unicameral legislature, and they also lost the weak central government, although it was pretty weak. But they wanted it weaker. But we were able to get the executive branch. We were able to get two houses in the legislature. We were able to get a judiciary branch. So they kind of lost, and they had to go along with this because they knew that the country depended on it. And when they returned to the southern states, they were going to be treated very badly because they didn't go do what their state sent them to go do, which was to revise the Articles of Confederation. Rather, they came up with the U.S. Constitution, which was completely different than what people at their state thought they were going to do. So, in an effort to preserve the nation, the young nation, in order to allow those southern representatives to go back and have some sway still at their state governments, the northern state representatives agreed in good faith. The southern states representatives believed that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, would be added to the U.S. Constitution quite immediately. And so the first 10 amendments were really a compromise and a gentleman's agreement between the southern states and the northern states for the southern representatives to go ahead and support this Constitution. So the agreement during the ratification of the U.S. Constitution that the Federalists would support the anti-Federalist position to incorporate individual liberties after initial ratification. That clause that I wrote in this, you're going to need to memorize. Okay? It's very important because the Bill of Rights, as we talked about Roseanne Barr and free speech, are very important in dealing with the government, but again, it's not in private institutions. So I'm going to take a quick break and come back to the supremacy elements.